The grand hall of the Stellar Confederation's embassy gleamed with soft blue light. Captain James stood at attention, his dress uniform feeling unusually tight around his neck. He didn't like ceremonies, especially not alien ones. But orders were orders, and saving the life of High Counselor Vess apparently warranted a formal recognition ceremony. "Step forward, Captain James of Earth," the alien diplomat announced, his crystalline voice echoing through the chamber. James took 3 measured steps forward, just as he'd been instructed. The marble-like floor reflected the stars visible through the transparent ceiling above. Around him, various alien diplomats and military officers watched with their strange, multifaceted eyes. "Your quick thinking and brave actions saved my life during the Nexus Station attack," High Counselor Vess said, his tall, elegant frame moving forward. "Such service cannot go unrewarded. Among our people, the greatest honor we can bestow is a life-debt gift." James noticed movement at the edge of the chamber. 2 Confederation guards led someone forward. No, not someone, but an alien woman. Her skin had a subtle purple tinge, and her hair seemed to shimmer with starlight. Her eyes were large and silver, like liquid mercury. She wore simple white robes that seemed to flow like water. The captain's stomach tightened. He'd heard rumors about these life-debt gifts, but he'd dismissed them as exaggerations. Surely in this age of interstellar travel and advanced civilizations. "This is Lyra," Vess announced proudly. "She is of the Astraea, one of our most honored races. Her life is now bound to yours, a living symbol of our gratitude." James felt the blood drain from his face. Every human instinct screamed at him to refuse, to lecture them about human rights and dignity. But he could see his commanding officer, General Rogers, giving him a stern look from the sidelines. This was more than just a ceremony. It was a crucial diplomatic moment. Lyra knelt gracefully before him, her head bowed. "I offer my service and loyalty, Captain James of Earth," she said in perfect English. Her voice was musical, but held a note of resignation that made his heart ache. James started, then caught himself. Years of military training kicked in. Handle the immediate situation, then deal with complications later. "I am honored by this gift," he said carefully, using the diplomatic phrases he'd been taught. High Counselor Vess beamed, or at least James thought it was beaming. Alien expressions were still hard to read. "The ceremony is complete. Let this strengthen the bonds between our peoples." The next hour passed in a blur of alien congratulations and diplomatic small talk. James kept glancing at Lyra, who stood quietly near him, speaking only when spoken to. Her responses were intelligent and measured, but her eyes remained downcast. Finally, they were cleared to leave. James led the way to his quarters in the human section of the station, his mind racing. As soon as the door closed behind them, he turned to Lyra. "Listen," he said gently. "I don't know what they told you, but humans don't believe in slavery or ownership of sentient beings. You're free to go wherever you want." Lyra looked up at him for the first time, genuine confusion in her mercury eyes. "Free?" She said the word as if it was in a foreign language. "Captain, I don't think you understand. This isn't slavery. It's an honor. A life debt is a sacred bond. But you can't just give people as gifts." James ran a hand through his short hair in frustration. "Can you not give your word, your loyalty, your service?" Lyra asked, her head tilting slightly. "These are things we choose to give, Captain. I chose this." James stared at her, suddenly unsure of everything he thought he knew. "Chose?" he asked weakly. Lyra's lips curved in a small smile, but her eyes held secrets. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "there is much we both need to learn about each other's ways." Looking at her, James had the distinct feeling he was in way over his head. Whatever he thought this day would bring, this was definitely not it. And somehow, he suspected this was only the beginning of a much more complicated story. The next morning, James woke to find his quarters spotlessly clean and the smell of coffee filling the air. Lyra stood by his small kitchen unit, carefully measuring out what looked like Earth-standard breakfast portions. "Good morning, Captain," she said, not turning around. "I hope you don't mind, but I studied Earth customs last night while you slept. The data files suggest breakfast is an important meal for humans." James sat up slowly, trying to process the situation. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "And please, just call me James." The files suggest informal address indicates either disrespect or close friendship. Lyra replied, finally turning to face him. "I wouldn't want to presume either." Her silver eyes seemed to shine brighter in the artificial morning light of the space station. James noticed she'd changed into a simple blue uniform similar to what civilian contractors wore. "About that," James said, accepting the coffee she offered. "We need to talk about your situation. I spent half the night reading regulations. There's nothing in Earth law that allows for what happened yesterday." Lyra sat down across from him, her movements graceful but measured. "Captain, may I explain something about my people?" At his nod, she continued, "The Astraea live by a code of bonds. Every relationship, every interaction is defined by mutual obligations. Without these bonds, we feel incomplete, lost." "But that's not freedom," James argued. "Isn't it?" Lyra's head tilted slightly. "Your military service, did someone force you into it?" "Of course not. I chose to serve. And now you're bound by orders, regulations, duty. How is that different from my choice to honor the life debt?" James opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He hadn't expected this level of philosophical debate before his first coffee of the day. A beeping sound interrupted them. James's communication unit. "Captain James here." "Captain, report to Briefing Room 3 immediately." General Rogers' voice crackled through. Bring the Astraean." James looked at Lyra, who was already standing. "We'll continue this discussion later," he said. The walk to the briefing room was tense. Other station personnel stared as they passed, some with curiosity, others with obvious disapproval. James noticed how Lyra seemed to position herself slightly behind his left shoulder, a traditional guard position in many cultures. General Rogers waited with two other officers and a civilian James didn't recognize. The civilian's eyes lit up when he saw Lyra. "Fascinating," the man exclaimed. "I'm Dr. Wilson, Cultural Studies. When I heard about yesterday's ceremony, I requested immediate consultation. Captain, do you realize the unique opportunity we have here?" "She's not a research subject," James said firmly. Of course, Wilson backdoled. "But surely you see the diplomatic implications. This is the first formal life bond between a human and an Astraean. The cultural exchange potential alone is exactly why we need to handle this carefully." General Rogers interrupted. "Captain, your new situation has created quite a stir. The Confederation considers this a major step forward in our relations. Earth Central Command is less enthusiastic." "With respect, sir," James started, but Lyra stepped forward. "If I may," she said, her voice carrying the new authority that made everyone stop. "The life bond is already formed. Attempting to break it would cause serious diplomatic damage. However, its exact nature is flexible." James looked at her sharply. There was something in her tone, a hint of something more beneath the surface. "What exactly do you mean by flexible?" General Rogers asked. "The bond requires that I serve," Lyra explained. "But the nature of that service can take many forms. I am, for instance, trained in interstellar diplomatic protocols and strategic analysis." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. James studied Lyra's profile, remembering her words from earlier. He had a growing suspicion that there was much more to this gift than anyone had told him. "We'll need time to consider the implications," General Rogers finally said. "In the meantime, Captain, keep a low profile. And," he glanced at Lyra, "keep us informed of any developments." As they left the briefing room, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The way Lyra moved, The careful precision of her words. This was no simple servant. The question was, what was she really? 3 days after the briefing, James sat in his quarters reviewing security reports when his datapad lit up with a priority alert. A series of strange energy signatures had been detected near the outer defense perimeter. As he studied the readings, Lyra looked up from her own work at the small desk he'd requisitioned for her. "Something's wrong," she said. It wasn't a question. James nodded. "Strange readings from..." He stopped, remembering her supposed status. But after 3 days of watching her work, his doubts had only grown. "The Crimson Belt sector," Lyra finished, moving to look at his screen. "Those energy patterns, they're familiar." James turned to her, his decision made. "All right, enough games. Who are you really?" Lyra's silver eyes met his. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a small crystal disc. When she placed it on his desk, it projected a holographic display showing military credentials, but not those of a servant. "Commander Lyra, 4th Fleet Strategic Command, Austrian Defense Force," she said quietly. "Or at least, I was until a week ago." James stared at the credentials, then at her. "You're a military strategist." "I was the military strategist who planned the defense of the Nexus station," she corrected. "The attack you helped prevent. My intelligence suggested it was coming, but the Confederation Council ignored my warnings, so I had to find another way." "The life bond ceremony," James said slowly. "It was a cover. The old traditions still hold power," Lyra explained, sitting down across from him. "Once bonded, I would have a legitimate reason to stay close to human military operations. No one questions a bonded Austrian's presence. It's expected." James rubbed his temples. "Why me?" "Because you acted to save lives without hesitation, even alien lives. Because your service record shows a pattern of ethical decisions, even when they're not convenient. And because," she smiled slightly, "you were the only human officer with high enough clearance who wasn't already under surveillance by the faction I'm investigating." "What faction?" Lyra's expression grew serious. "There's a group within the Confederation that believes humans are advancing too quickly, gaining too much influence. They orchestrated the attack on Nexus Station, hoping to damage human Confederation relations. That attempt failed, but they're planning something bigger." James looked back at the energy readings on his screen. "Like whatever's causing these signatures." "Exactly." Lyra moved closer, her fingers dancing over the display. "These patterns match experimental weapons tech I investigated 3 months ago. Technology that officially doesn't exist. I need to report this to command," James said, reaching for his comm unit. Lyra's hand caught his. "Not yet. The faction has infiltrators everywhere. That's why High Counselor Vess helped arrange this. As my bonded, you're now part of an Austrian household. That gives us certain privileges, including private communications channels they can't monitor." James sat back, processing everything. "So for the past 3 days, while everyone's been arguing about cultural sensitivity and diplomatic implications, we've been establishing our cover, yes." Lyra's mercury eyes held a hint of amusement. "You played your part perfectly, by the way. Your obvious discomfort with the situation made it all very convincing." "Glad I could help," James said dryly. "So what now?" "Now," Lyra said, turning back to the energy readings, "we find out what they're planning. But we'll need help." She pressed something on her uniform collar, and suddenly her posture changed, becoming more formal. "Captain, if you're not too busy, perhaps you could show me the station's tactical operations center. As you're bonded, I should understand your work environment." James heard footsteps passing outside his quarters and understood. The act had to continue. "Of course," he said, standing. "Though I'm not sure how much you'll understand of our human technology." Lyra's eyes sparkled with hidden humor as she fell into step behind his left shoulder. "I'm sure I'll manage to learn something useful, Captain." As they walked through the station's corridors, James realized that his life had just become much more complicated and much more interesting. The only question was, what would they find in the tactical center? And who could they really trust? The Tactical Operations Center hummed with activity. James watched as Lyra studied the main display screen, her silver eyes reflecting the blue glow of the star charts. They had managed to access the secure area thanks to his clearance, but now came the tricky part. "Those energy signatures are moving," Lyra whispered, pointing to a cluster of dots on the screen. "They're following a pattern." "Lieutenant Reed," James called to the young officer monitoring the sensors. "Can you pull up the last week's data for Sector 7? As Reed worked, James noticed two officers entering the room. He recognized them as part of General Rogers' personal staff. Lyra immediately lowered her eyes and stepped back, resuming her role as the submissive bondservant. "Captain James," one of the officers said, "interesting to find you here. With company." "Just familiarizing my companion with the station's operations," James replied carefully. "As is my right under the diplomatic protocols." The officers exchanged looks but couldn't argue. The life bond ceremony had given Lyra certain privileges, even if they made the human military uncomfortable. "Sir," Reed called out, "I've got that data you requested." Everyone turned to the main screen. A week's worth of sensor data played out in fast forward, showing the mysterious energy signatures appearing and disappearing across different sectors. "Their testing ranges," Lyra murmured, just loud enough for James to hear, "and response times." James felt a chill run down his spine. Someone was probing their defenses, checking how quickly they could detect and respond to threats. But before he could look closer, an alarm blared through the station. "Multiple contacts," Reed shouted, coming out of FTL at the edge of Sector 7. The main screen filled with new signatures. 5 ships had appeared where the energy readings had been strongest. Their design was unlike anything in the official Confederation registry. "Battle stations," James ordered, his training kicking in. "Reed, get me a." "Belay that order," a new voice commanded. General Rogers strode into the tactical center, flanked by armed guards. "Captain James, step away from the controls." James didn't move. "Sir, we have unknown vessels." "Those vessels are authorized to be there," Rogers interrupted, "which you would know if you had the proper clearance." Lyra stepped forward, dropping all pretense of servitude. "They're carrying the prototype weapons, aren't they, General? The ones that can bypass human shields." Rogers' face hardened. "I knew letting an Astrian spy into our facility was a mistake. Take them both into custody." "Sir," James said, his voice carrying through the now silent room, "those ships are in attack formation. Whatever you think you know." A massive explosion rocked the station. Warning lights flashed as the tactical display showed multiple hull breaches. "They betrayed you," Lyra said to Rogers, her voice sharp, "just like they betrayed my people. Those ships aren't here for a demonstration. They're here to start a war." Another explosion hit, closer this time. James made a split-second decision. He grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her toward the emergency exit. "Stop them," Rogers shouted, but the room had erupted into chaos as more explosions shook the station. James and Lyra raced through the corridors, alarms blaring around them. "We need to get to the auxiliary control room," James said as they ran. "It's the only place we can expose what's really happening. If we can access my encrypted files," Lyra agreed, keeping pace with him, "we can prove the conspiracy exists. But they'll try to stop us." They rounded a corner and found themselves face to face with 2 armed guards. Before James could react, Lyra moved with startling speed, disarming one guard while James tackled the other. "Still think I'm just a servant?" Lyra asked with a slight smile as they collected the guards' weapons. "Never did," James replied, checking the corridor ahead. "But we've got bigger problems. The whole station's at risk, and Rogers probably isn't the only one involved in this plot." "Then we better hurry," Lyra said, her silver eyes glinting with determination. Because those ships out there, they're just the beginning. The auxiliary control room's door sparked as James forced it open. Inside, emergency lights cast red shadows across abandoned workstations. Another explosion rocked the station, making them stumble. "They're targeting the main reactor," Lyra said, rushing to a console. Her fingers flew across the controls. "But they're being careful not to cause a complete meltdown. They want to disable the station, not destroy it." James secured the door behind them. "That's something, at least. How long to access your files?" 2 minutes, maybe less." Lyra pulled the crystal disk from her uniform and inserted it into the console's reader. The encryption showed. The console screen flashed red. "Access denied." A mechanical voice announced. "Security lockout in effect." "No," Lyra muttered, trying another sequence. "They've locked us out of the system completely." James looked over her shoulder at the screen. "Can we bypass it?" "Not without." Lyra's silver eyes suddenly widened. "The life bond. Captain, your command codes combined with my Australian diplomatic status. It's a combination they wouldn't have planned for." James quickly entered his authorization code while Lyra placed her hand on the biometric scanner. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered in change. "Access granted. Welcome, Captain James. Welcome, Commander Lyra." "Quick thinking," James said as Lyra began downloading her files. "The beauty of their own prejudices," she replied with a grim smile. "They never imagined a slave gift would have high-level access codes." The screen filled with data, secret communications, weapon designs, transfer orders, evidence of a conspiracy reaching into both human and Confederation leadership. "Look at this," James pointed to a message thread. "They're not just trying to start a war. They're trying to force both sides into it. The attack on this station is meant to trigger automatic retaliation protocols, which would lead to a full-scale conflict," Lyra finished. And in the chaos, they cooled. The door exploded inward. Through the smoke, General Rogers stepped in with 4 armed guards. "I'm disappointed, Captain," Rogers said, training his weapon on them. "You had such a promising career ahead of you." "Why, General?" James asked, shifting slightly to shield Lyra as she continued the download behind him. "You've seen what humans and aliens can accomplish together. Why help start a war?" "Because humanity needs to stand alone," Rogers replied. "We're becoming too dependent on alien technology, alien culture. This cooperation is making us weak." "That's not true," Lyra said, her voice strong. "Your isolation would doom both our peoples. The faction promised you power, didn't they? A chance to protect humanity." Rogers' face twisted. "They promised us freedom. Freedom from alien influence. From..." Another explosion cut him off, bigger than before. The station's artificial gravity flickered. In that moment of chaos, James moved. He tackled Rogers while Lyra dealt with 2 of the guards, her combat training evident in every motion. "Download complete," Lyra shouted over the sound of fighting. James knocked Rogers unconscious and grabbed the general's comm unit. "This is Captain James to all stations. Security override Alpha 7 Delta. General Rogers is relieved of command under suspicion of treason. The attacking ships are not authorized Confederation vessels. Repeat, we are under attack by hostile forces." "It's too late," one of the conscious guards laughed. "The retaliation protocols have been suspended." A new voice came over the station's comm system. High Counselor Vess's distinctive tones filled the room. "Captain James, Commander Lyra, your evidence has been received and verified. Confederation forces are moving to intercept the hostile ships." James and Lyra looked at each other, breathing hard from the fight. "Not bad for a gift," Lyra said with a slight smile. "Not bad for a human?" James asked. "No," she replied, her silver eyes serious. "Not bad for partners." But as they heard more explosions in the distance, they knew this was far from over. The faction's plans had been exposed, but the real battle was just beginning. Warning klaxons filled the station's corridors as James and Lyra raced toward the main defense control center. Behind them, security teams were securing the unconscious General Rogers and his conspirators. 3 of the enemy ships are still out there, Lyra said, checking a data pad as they ran. They're trying to retreat to the jump point. We can't let them escape, James replied. They'll just regroup and try again somewhere else. They burst into the defense control center, where chaos reigned. Officers rushed between stations, trying to coordinate the station's damaged defense systems. Status report, James commanded. Shields at 40%. One officer shouted. 2 Confederation cruisers have arrived to assist, but those enemy ships are using some kind of shield-piercing technology. Our weapons can barely touch them. Lyra pushed forward to study the tactical display. The weapon designs were in my files. They're using a phase-shifted energy field tow. She stopped, her silver eyes widening. Captain, let me take tactical control. The officers looked at James uncertainly. Even after everything that had happened, they hesitated to trust an alien with their weapons. Do it, James ordered. He'd seen enough to know that doubting Lyra was a mistake. Her fingers flew across the tactical console. The weapons work by shifting slightly out of phase with normal space. But that means she input a complex series of commands. If we modify our shield frequencies to match their phase shift, the main screen showed their shields changing color, shifting through different energy patterns. Their next shot should pass through our shields, Lyra explained quickly, but then be caught in a resonance loop. The energy will feed back into their own systems. You're going to turn their weapons against them, James realized. A flash of light lit up the screen as one of the enemy ships fired. The beam passed through the station's shields, then suddenly reversed direction, striking the attacking ship. Its shields flared and collapsed. Confederation cruiser Starlight, fire on target 1. Lyra commanded through the comm. Their shields are down. The cruiser's weapons struck true. The enemy ship erupted in a ball of flame. The other ships are accelerating, someone reported. They're making a run for the jump point. Not if I can help it, Lyra muttered. Her hands danced across the console again. Captain, I need your authorization to access the station's main power core. James placed his hand on the security scanner without hesitation. Whatever you need. I'm going to channel emergency power into a focused shield burst. It should disrupt their engines, but she looked at him seriously. It might overload our systems. We'd be defenseless. Do it. Energy surged through the station. The lights dimmed as power was diverted to Lyra's calculations. A wave of invisible force burst from the station, catching the fleeing ships. Direct hit, an officer shouted. Their engines are failing. Confederation forces moving to intercept, another reported. They're powering down weapons. They're surrendering. A cheer went up around the control center. James felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he noticed Lyra was still focused on her console. What is it? He asked quietly. Their surrender was too easy, she replied, her voice low. And look at these power readings from their ships. They're building towards something. Before James could respond, all 3 enemy ships suddenly blazed with energy. Warning signals screamed across every console. They're overloading their reactors. Lyra shouted. The explosion will take out half the sector, including the station. James looked at their options. The station's shields were drained. The Confederation cruisers were too close to the enemy ships to escape the blast radius. Time seemed to slow as he made his decision. Everyone abandon the defense center, he ordered. Lyra, with me. We've got one chance to stop this, but we'll have to do it manually. As they ran toward the station's engineering section, James knew they were racing against time. The enemy would rather die than be captured, and they wanted to take everyone with them. But he wasn't about to let that happen. Not while he still had a say in it. The engineering section was bathed in red emergency lighting as James and Lyra burst through the doors. Warning signals showed the enemy ship's reactor levels climbing toward critical mass. 3 minutes until detonation, Lyra announced, rushing to the main engineering console. The blast will take out everything within half a light second. How do we stop it? James asked, securing the doors behind them. We can't. Lyra's fingers flew across the controls. But we can contain it. The station's power core. If we can create a focused containment field around their ships. James understood immediately. We'd need to divert all power. Life support, gravity, everything. Yes, and someone would need to manually maintain the field from here. The controls are too damaged for automation. Lyra looked at him, her silver eyes reflecting the emergency lights. You should evacuate with the others. Not happening, James said firmly. We started this together. We'll finish it together. A small smile crossed Lyra's face. I was hoping you'd say that. She reached into her uniform and pulled out a second crystal disc. This contains everything. The full conspiracy. All the names, all the evidence. High Counselor Vess needs to get this. He will, James promised, taking the disc. Now, what's first? Working together, they began the complex process of rerouting the station's power. Throughout the station, lights went dark. Gravity failed. Only the engineering section maintained minimal systems. 1 minute, Lyra reported. Containment field at 60%. James's hands were steady on the controls despite the sweat on his forehead. We need more power. Wait. Lyra's eyes widened. The life bond. The quantum resonance it creates. We could use it to stabilize the containment field. The what? No time to explain. Do you trust me? James met her gaze. Always. Lyra placed one hand on the power core controls and held out her other hand to James. Then help me save them all. James took her hand. Suddenly, he felt a strange energy flowing between them. The console lights surged brighter. Containment field at 90%, Lyra said, her voice trained. Reactors reaching critical. The main screen showed the enemy ships glowing with deadly energy. Then they exploded, but instead of destruction, the blast was contained within a shimmering sphere of energy. It's working. James watched as the containment field held the massive explosion, compressing it smaller and smaller until it finally winked out of existence. Field collapse in 3, 2, 1. Lyra counted down. The energy sphere disappeared, leaving only floating debris where the enemy ships had been. They'd done it. The engineering console lit up with incoming messages. The Confederation cruisers were safe. The station had survived. Emergency power was being restored. Captain James, High Counselor Vess's voice came over the comm. Commander Lyra. The station's sensors show. Well, I'm not entirely sure what they show. But I assume we have you to thank for our continued existence. Yes, sir, James replied. And we have evidence to deliver. Excellent. Though I believe some explanations are in order, particularly about certain traditional ceremonies and their true purposes. Lyra laughed softly. I look forward to explaining everything, Counselor, though perhaps some details might be best left to tradition. As emergency teams began arriving at engineering, James looked at Lyra. So about that quantum resonance. A real thing, she assured him, though perhaps not traditionally used quite like that. It seems humans and Astrians can accomplish remarkable things together. Speaking of together, James said carefully, now that the crisis is over, the life bond is whatever we choose it to be, Lyra finished. Though I admit, I've grown rather attached to this partnership. James smiled. Partnership. I like the sound of that. High above them, through the station's viewports, stars shone peacefully. The conspiracy had been exposed, war had been prevented, and two peoples had drawn a little closer together. Not bad, James thought. for what had started as an unwanted gift. "So," he asked, ready to help me write up the incident report. Lyra's silver eyes sparkled with amusement. "Always, Captain. Though perhaps we should leave out the part about using ancient alien bond magic to contain a thermonuclear explosion." "Probably for the best," James agreed. "Some things really are better left to tradition."